Hey, welcome back. Accounting 604. This is now video number 7, our last video in module 4. And as you can see here from the title slide, in this very last video, we are touching on the topic of disaggregating RNOA, or return on net operating assets. And so we just built RNOA in video number 6, and now we're disaggregating it. What are we doing here? Let's take a look. Well, we are disaggregating RNOA into two elements: net operating profit margin and net operating asset turnover. And quite frankly, this should remind you of the third video in this module when we did this similar disaggregation to return on assets. And there, return on assets, you may remember, we disaggregated into plain old vanilla profit margin and plain old vanilla asset turnover. And by now, those may be dear old friends to you, all the way dating back 5 videos, so to speak. But let us now look at the operating versions of the same calculation, the same conceptual disaggregation. You look in the tan box on the slide, and obviously you can see that RNOA, the calculation we've already sort of developed, which is NOPAT divided by the average level of net operating assets. And so mathematically, you understand, essentially all we're doing is we're multiplying two fractions together, and when you do that, then the two similar terms cancel out, which would be, in this particular illustration, sales. But what we're really talking about is these two individual elements with an operating focus. We are talking about the profit margin that operational profit contributes, and then how effectively are we converting net operating assets into the level of sales that we enjoy, right? It's, of course, very, very similar to profit margin and asset turnover in the disaggregation of return on assets, but we are focusing narrowly on the operating versions of both of those elements, stripping out the non-operating elements, the non-operating contribution to income and profit, and the non-operating assets, respectively, in these two equations, right? So what do we end up with? As you can see here, narrowly defined NOPM, or net operating profit margin, is really an attempt for us to understand how much operating profit that is earned from each sales dollar. Not just pure profit, or aggregated profit, but operating profit. And so NOPM for 2022 for Pfizer, you can see here, is 31.3%. And really, I mean, this has come up on one of the earlier homework problems. The best way to understand 31.3% might be simply to remember there are 100 cents in a dollar. And therefore, what we're really talking about is what? Well, we're talking about 31 cents. Out of every dollar of sales, Pfizer earns 31 cents of operating profit after accounting for all the expenses, okay? And just as a point of comparison across the industries, right, median S&P 500 is 15 cents in 2022, and of course you see there Pfizer was more than double that, right? And like the ROA versions of this, in the same way, net operating profit margin is primarily affected by COGS and SG&A, right? Cost of goods sold, right, which would be clearly defined as operating expenses, and then what other else administrative overhead that is responsible for maintaining and executing your operational activities, which is basically the definition of SG&A. All right. So then we look at the other component that we are disaggregating out of RNOA, and that would be net operating asset turnover. And so net operating asset turnover, defined as measuring the productivity of the company's net operating assets. Not all assets, just the net operating assets. And so you can see here the tan basically constructs that in the fraction using the same sales revenue number as we have been throughout this module, but then using the net operating assets beginning and end and averaging the amount. You do the math, you end up with basically a little over $1 of revenue. In other words, for every dollar of net operating assets, Pfizer is generating $1.03 of revenue. Now, you can see here, average across the entire S&P 500 for that same period was about $1.08, $1.08, right? So Pfizer is basically right in the average, the median. So, conceptually, of course, right? How do companies increase operating asset turnover? You can do a couple of different things. You could increase the level of sales for a given level of assets. So in other words, you keep your investment in capital, your capital investment in the structure of operations the same, but somehow you figure out in your marketplace, how do I yield more sales out of that? That's one way to do it, right? Or you keep the level of revenue the same and you find a way to cut back on the level of operating assets. In other words, both of these, I guess, really is getting more out of less, so to speak, right? And of course, if you really have some strategic insight, you might be able to both increase the level of sales while simultaneously reducing the underlying level of operating assets, at which point, if you are doing that, I might suggest there are companies sending you unsolicited requests for your resume. Would you like to come work for them, right? In both of those ways, right, there are methods that are available to either increase profit margin or net operating asset turnover. And again, we pointed this out, I think, in Deck 3. There's multiple ways to skin a cat, and that may differ depending on the industry we're talking about, right? Because here, you see here that orange line in this graph attempts to graph out a return on net operating assets of 14.9% across various different industries. And so you can see here that over in the upper left-hand corner, the consumer staples industries will typically leverage very high operating asset turnover with a relatively low profit margin per gallon of milk sold, or those kinds of things, right? And at the far other end, out by the long tail on this, in the lower right-hand corner, you can see that companies like oil, gas, consumable fuels, semiconductors, and then, of course, pharmaceuticals, which is the example company that we've been looking at throughout this module with Pfizer, right? Instead, what they will typically do is utilize regular, somewhat run-of-the-mill net operating asset turnover, but they will really focus on larger than life profit margins in order to realize their return on net operating assets. And this, of course, is really exactly what we are looking at, right? So a summary of this concept for you today, you can see that, like ROA, return on net operating assets, is driven by two things: profit margin and asset turnover, but in this case, the operating focus of each of those examinations. So it's the same question in a sense, right? With an operating focus. How do you try to win as a company, as an organization? Do you try to win by a sterling profit per every unit of sold, or do you do it by an efficient use of your assets? And then again, just a reminder throughout this module, when we disaggregate into an OPM and net operating asset turnover, we are filtering out financing effects and other non-operational activity noise. And so a reminder that the reason we do all this is that sustainable performance comes from operations, at least over the long term, right? Now, something we do want to point out, that if we benchmark, take a company and use it to benchmark against peers in the same industry, this is where you get a finer examination of a company's strengths and, of course, alternatively, perhaps their weaknesses, right? And specifically regarding Pfizer, which is the company, of course, we've been examining this whole module, really the star that is bringing the show is net operating profit margin. Is almost double the S&P median, while net operating asset turnover was essentially the median average, right? In other words, we can conclude that, as is natural for the pharmaceutical industry, Pfizer's strength in 2022 was margin driven. This examination we've looked at now proves it by actual evidence and analysis. Now, I want to give you then one last slide for you to consider. And again, this is sort of a look at taking everything that we've learned in Module 4 and really thinking about these things as managerial decision makers. So if you look at the slide now, what I've reproduced is the little sidebar you will find on page 429 of your text entitled, "You Are the CEO." And so essentially, here's the question. Whatever industry you may be thinking of, or whatever, let's say you're the CEO of your company and you're analyzing its performance, as you should be. And your analysis of return on net operating assets reveals the following. And I've given you basically, or the book has given you two sets of numbers. The industry benchmarks for you to compare with are in the parentheses. Your return on net operating assets is 16%, while the industry benchmark is 10%. Your net operating profit margin is 18%, whilst the industry average is 17%. And your net operating asset turnover is 0.89, whereas the industry average is 0.59. So as you look at that set of numbers, here's a couple of questions. What interpretations do you draw that are useful for managing your company? And then, perhaps most importantly, given your interpretations, what strategic path or paths would you suggest based on your analysis? And this is really the heart and soul of managerial decision making, right? The real point of good, hard, solid, evidence-based analysis is not simply to glory in your analysis, but then to use that to intelligently and wisely make managerial choices and decisions how to continue to improve and capture even greater sustainable, scalable, competitive advantage. The example I sometimes use, so I'll just leave this here at the very end of this lecture, is I had for years taught physically at the Hayward campus. I still do. I just don't find myself on the Hayward campus that frequently. For some of you who have been to our Hayward campus for Cal State East Bay, you realize there is a very, very, very steep hill that leads off of campus. I believe it's Carlos B. And I tell you, years ago, one summer, what I saw, which just sort of scared the daylights out of me, was a student on a longboard. Those of you unfamiliar with that term, it's like a longer version of a skateboard. And he's going down Carlos B on his longboard. Shorts, flip-flops, tank top, no helmet or gloves, starting to make his way, weaving down Carlos B, down that very, very steep hill. I turned the other direction. I didn't want to see what happened because I think the odds were probably pretty good that movie did not end well, if you know what I'm talking about. So let us say, for example, that dude ends up in the ER, and he ends up there, hooked up to a bunch of stuff, and his elbow is, maybe it's bending the wrong way, you know what I'm talking about, right? And so they call his parents, and the attending doctor brings the parents in and says, hey, for starters, I would like you to look at the x-ray I've taken of your son's injuries. Let's start there. And what would happen if the doctor said, as you look at this x-ray, you can see here that there are some things broken, but what I really want you to notice, this might be one of the finest x-rays I have ever taken in terms of aesthetics and art. I mean, my use of negative space here and the way that I have used the rule of thirds to position the compound fracture in your son's, okay, right, you get my point. The whole point of the x-ray is not for an art photograph. It's in order to suggest a path of getting the kid fixed, getting his injuries repaired, right? The whole point of this exercise and the other exercises that we will perform in this course are not for you to become expert at analysis in and of itself, for you to glory in the X-ray. Your goal is to use that as a tool, one of several tools at your disposal, in order to develop strategic paths of recommended course of action in order to either correct some of the things that need to be corrected at a particular company or to elevate performance even higher. That is really the goal of this, and I just wanted to remind all of us of this at the conclusion of this deck as you think about all of the various components and parts of the analysis we've talked about in this module. So thanks so much for your attention. We will see you in the next set of modules.